My name is Ethan, and this horrific thing happened to me during the summer of my sophomore year in college, when I was forced to rent a cheap studio apartment on the ground floor of an old brick building in the suburbs of Chicago. The midsummer weather was suffocating and driving me crazy, and the air was thick with the musty stench of old walls that had not been repaired for years. This building was mostly rented by poor laborers and a few broke students, and everyone kept to themselves, including the neighbor in the next room named Dale, a middle-aged guy who always wore a faded tank top, had deeply sunken eyes, and a twisted, creepy smile. The only characteristic that caught my attention about Dale was that he often stood in the hallway just to stare at the shoes or personal items that other people left in front of their doors with a pathological focus. The suffocating heat of the Chicago summer, combined with the relentless buzzing of cicadas outside the window and the sound of the old fan in my room, buzzing every night, created an extremely oppressive background noise. Late one night, while I was sitting and studying, I heard the sound of shuffling footsteps, stopping right in front of my door, lasting for a full 15 minutes without knocking or leaving. Looking through the peephole on the door under the dim hallway light, I saw Dale pressing his face flat against my wooden door, motionless, just standing there dead silent and taking deep breaths, as if he was trying to smell the scent from inside the room. Ever since that night, at exactly 3 in the morning, while the fan in my room was running steadily, I started hearing soft scratching and tiny shuffling sounds coming from right underneath the old carpet in my bedroom. At first, I reassured myself that it was just sewer rats gnawing on the pipes in the summer, but the level of abnormality grew when small, deeply personal items began to vanish without a trace. From my razor and spare toothbrush to a few hair ties left behind by my girlfriend, everything just disappeared strangely. I felt like my sanity was completely falling apart. The room door was always tightly locked from the inside with 2 iron bolts, and the windows were securely latched. Yet my belongings seemed to have grown legs and walked away. I brought this matter up to the building manager, but he just brushed it off. He claimed that the building was old, so the wooden structure often expanded and contracted due to the summer heat, and that the missing items were just due to my forgetfulness. The situation reached a boiling point one afternoon when I went to do my laundry in the common laundry room at the end of the hallway and ran into Dale. He looked at me with a hungry gaze and uttered a chilling sentence. "Your room has such a pleasant scent, Ethan. It smells just like life itself." The fear inside me turned into absolute vigilance when I noticed that the leather bracelet I had lost the previous week was now being worn proudly on his hairy wrist. My biggest limitation was that I had no solid evidence to call the police. My lease still had 3 months left, and I completely lacked the money to move somewhere else immediately. That meant I had to continue facing this freak every single night. Those bizarre scratching noises underneath the floorboards at 3 in the morning appeared constantly with an increasingly dense frequency. It was no longer those random, aimless shuffling sounds like before. I could clearly hear that the noise was moving with a specific route. It crawled slowly along the exact path from the bottom of my bed, dragged across the wardrobe, and then stopped right beneath my desk. The feeling of my private space being brutally and shamelessly invaded drove me into a state of severe sleep deprivation. Day and night, I was constantly haunted by the sensation that a pair of eyes filled with murderous intent was staring intently at me from some dark corner inside this cramped studio. The boiling point came on a Friday morning when I just woke up. I was horrified to discover a faint handprint covered in a black grease-like substance clinging right on the edge of the floor carpet in the corner of the bedroom. It looked exactly as if someone had just tried to lift the carpet from underneath but got stuck on a terribly sweltering. Friday night, the air conditioning system for the entire building suddenly broke down. My room at this point was suffocatingly hot, no different from a corpse cremation furnace. A foul stench, a musty odor, mixed with the smell of rotting flesh from beneath the floor, began to waft up heavily, becoming completely unbearable. When the familiar scratching sound echoed again at exactly 3 in the morning, I knew I could not take it for another single second. The anger and panic bottled up for so long finally pushed me to my absolute limit. I was forced to take decisive action to put an end to these days of brutal mental torture. I bolted out of bed, grabbed a super bright flashlight, along with a large, rusty iron bar kept in the corner of the door. I took heavy steps toward the position of the carpet in the bedroom to directly confront the monstrosity lurking underneath. I kicked the wooden chair aside to clear my path. My hands tightly gripped the edge of the dusty old carpet. With all the strength I could muster, I ripped it backward. Beneath the carpet lay a secret wooden hatch used for maintaining the underground pipes that ran along the building. I used the iron bar to pry hard against the rusted latch of the hatch. The sound of rotting wood snapping echoed sharply through the dead silence. The moment the hatch swung open, I aimed my super bright flashlight straight into the narrow, pitch-black space below. The beam of light swept past years of accumulated trash and stopped right at a human figure. That person was curling up in a deformed and bizarre posture. It was Dale. He was completely naked. One of his hands held my missing toothbrush, which he was shoving into his mouth and gnawing on ravenously. His other hand was gripping a rusty utility knife. He slowly raised his eyes to stare intently at me through the gap of the open hatch. He flashed a wide grin that stretched all the way to his ears, looking absolutely repulsive. "Ethan, did you come down here to be with me?" Dale let out a freakish shriek and suddenly lunged his entire body straight up toward the hatch opening. His hand swung the utility knife high, missing my face by just a fraction of an inch. I panicked completely, and by pure natural reflex, I swung the iron bar hard against his head. The sound of metal slamming into a human skull let out a sickening, loud crack. The heavy blow made him lose his balance, sending him crashing backward into the dark space beneath the floorboards. I burst into tears as I scrambled and crawled away from the open hatch in absolute terror. I immediately grabbed my phone and dialed the police with trembling fingers. Right beneath my feet, the sound of Dale frantically scratching against the wooden walls kept rustling without pause. When the police burst into the room and subdued Dale, they proceeded to examine that underground crawlspace. The police discovered that the freak renting the room next door had been quietly destroying the building structure for a long time. He had pried open the brickwork from inside his own wardrobe to break through the walls. That passageway led directly into the pipe maintenance system, right under my bedroom floor weeks ago. Every single one of my missing personal items had been collected carefully by him. He used duct tape to stick all those things all over the wooden joists right under my floor. It formed a twisted kind of shrine that he had dedicated solely to me. That proved he had been lying right down there this entire time. He had been listening to my every breath, my every footstep, and watching everything I did through the tiny cracks in the floorboards. Dale was taken away by the police that very night on charges of felony breaking and entering, weapons possession, and aggravated stalking. He was committed directly to a forensic psychiatric hospital after doctors concluded he suffered from late-stage persecutory delusional disorder. The building manager was heavily fined and cited by the police for gross negligence in property maintenance, for allowing a tenant to compromise the building's structural integrity and endanger others. The very next morning, I packed up all my clothes and luggage to get the hell out of that wretched place. I left behind all the furniture and that foul carpet without even bothering to get my security deposit back. Years have passed since then, and I have graduated and moved into a modern high-rise apartment in a completely different city. This place has a floor cast from solid, reinforced concrete. However, the horrific memory loop of that summer has never truly let me go, leaving behind a psychological scar that time cannot heal. Every time a sweltering summer night arrives, and I hear the steady hum of my fan in the dead silence, I still startle awake at exactly 3 a.m. I instinctively press my ear against the floor to check, because I am always terrified that, in some hidden dark crawl space, someone is still curling up and waiting for me. Technologies are born to help us connect, but sometimes they inadvertently connect us with things that shouldn't belong to this world. I never thought that moving to the Pennsylvania suburbs in search of peace would be the biggest mistake of my life. Most of the 2-story wooden houses in this town were built in the last century, packed closely together and separated only by low fences. As a freelance software engineer, I spent most of my time within 4 walls, befriending complex lines of code and high-end wireless audio systems used for app testing. I preferred working at night, when the whole neighborhood had fallen asleep and the noisy sounds of the day had completely vanished. The life of a bachelor, no family, no pets. always operated on an incredibly tedious and closed orbit. The only neighbor within my line of sight was Mr. Silas. He was an old man in his late 70s who had been severely deaf since his youth and lived alone in the house opposite mine ever since his wife passed away. Between Mr. Silas and me, there was an invisible but respectful boundary regarding each other's privacy. We rarely stepped into each other's yards, and the only connection between our two lonely souls was a distant, polite nod of greeting. Every night, through the glass window of my second-floor study, I would see Mr. Silas sitting motionless in his old leather armchair placed right by his window. Our two bedrooms faced each other, separated only by a narrow pedestrian walkway less than 2 meters wide. On Mr. Silas's ear, an old-fashioned, beige hearing aid always appeared, an outdated device with a tiny internal antenna protruding outward, its plastic rim yellowed with time. The old man just sat there, his eyes staring straight toward the neon light from my desk, like a harmless habit, to seek a little human warmth in the quiet summer nights. I never found it bothersome because his presence was like a living alarm clock, reminding me that I wasn't the only creature still awake in this neighborhood. The weather lately had shifted into mid-year. The night sky was always crystal clear without a single ripple of wind, making the surrounding space strangely silent. It was just an ordinary summer night. A night when I thought I would finish my software project on time to hand it over to my client. But I had no idea that the absolute stillness of the night outside was the perfect curtain to hide a chain of horrifying events about to crash down upon me. Everything began to change late one Tuesday night. It was about 2 in the morning. I was sitting in front of 3 large monitors, wearing high-end, over-ear active noise-canceling headphones, to focus on testing a new segment of source code. The soundproofing was so perfect that I could only hear the click-clack of my own typing. Suddenly, a piercing static hiss cut through the lo-fi music in my headphones. It sounded like the interference of a short-range radio, continuous and grating. I frowned, intending to take off the headphones to check the audio jack. But before I could raise my hand, the static abruptly died down, giving way to a completely different frequency. It was a heavily amplified audio stream, carrying the distinct background hiss of vintage recording equipment. And then, I heard breathing. It wasn't the slow, halting breath of a man in his late 70s like Mr. Silas. It was the heavy, rapid panting of someone undergoing intense physical exertion or suppressing extreme agitation. I startled, immediately spinning my chair around to look straight through the window toward the house next door. Under the dim yellow nightlight casting from Mr. Silas's second-floor bedroom, his silhouette still sat motionless in the leather armchair. His curtains were only half drawn, enough for me to see that his silver-gray head was still facing my direction, completely still. I told myself that my old headphones had probably intercepted the frequency of a walkie-talkie somewhere in the neighborhood, or perhaps it was interference from Mr. Silas's hearing aid. I closed the audio application, restarted my computer, and went back to work, but that peace did not last long. Over the next 2 nights, this strange interference began to repeat with increasing frequency, and it no longer stopped at my headphones. The following night, while I was having dinner in the first-floor living room, the smart speaker in the corner suddenly activated itself. It didn't play music. Instead, it emitted that exact same static sound from the hearing aid frequency. The tension inside me began to escalate as the audio captured through this frequency grew clearer and more detailed. Beside the heavy panting, my home's wireless audio system began picking up sounds of physical movement. There were very heavy footsteps, as if someone were deliberately putting their entire body weight into stepping as quietly as possible on a wooden floor. Next came the sharp, metallic clinking of iron tools brushing against one another, and most terrifyingly, the distinct clicking of a window latch being pried open with a specialized tool. I froze for a few seconds, my heart beating faster than usual. The first thought that crossed my mind was that Mr. Silas was in danger. I assumed a burglar was taking advantage of the old man's severe deafness to break in, ransack, and rob his house right before my eyes without him knowing. I was about to pick up my phone to call the local police, but then I hesitated. I had no solid evidence other than strange noises on my audio equipment. That hesitation was the biggest mistake that dragged me into the quagmire of panic. The climax of the horror occurred on the 4th night. It was exactly 3 in the morning. I was sitting alone in my second-floor office, surrounded by darkness, with only the light from the computer screen reflecting onto my face. The familiar static suddenly blared, this time so loud it made my ears wince with pain. I hit the record button on my computer to capture the audio as evidence, but as the amplified audio stream poured in, my entire body instantly froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Through the short-range frequency, I heard footsteps slowly ascending a wooden staircase. It creaked on the exact fifth step, a sound far too familiar, one I had to hear every single day. It wasn't the layout of Mr. Silas's house. Mr. Silas's house had carpeted concrete floors. It had no squeaking wooden staircase. Next, through the headphones, I heard the rustling sound of a thin canvas curtain being pushed aside. That was the exact curtain hanging in my own second-floor hallway. The blood in my veins turned to ice as I recognized the acoustic architecture. The intruder wasn't in the house opposite mine. He wasn't at Mr. Silas's house. He was already inside my house, and he was stepping along the hallway, advancing toward my office at 3 o'clock in the morning. Everything inside me seemed to shatter as I stared at the office doorknob. The round brass handle was slowly, deliberately turning downward. The person on the other side of the door was doing it with an agonizing, spine-chilling patience. Trembling, I yanked my headphone plug out of the computer. Cold sweat soaked through the back of my shirt, despite the air conditioning. I reached blindly under the desk and gripped the metal baseball bat I kept there. My palms were so slick with sweat that holding the metal bar became slippery and difficult. The rattling from the lock stopped as the latch was fully retracted. In the sheer panic of a cornered animal, I knew I couldn't just sit there and wait to die. I rushed straight to my office window and pushed the glass panes open with all my might. I needed oxygen, and I needed someone to see me. I directed my gaze straight at the bedroom window of the house opposite, desperate for help. "Mr. Silas, help me!" I tried to scream at the top of my lungs, but the sound choked in my throat, coming out as a weak whimpering moan. The pale yellow streetlight from the road reflected up into the neighbor's window. That dim light was just enough to illuminate the entire space inside the old man's room. A cruel and horrific truth unfolded before my eyes, leaving me entirely paralyzed. Mr. Silas was still sitting motionless in that old leather armchair, just like any other night. But his silver-gray head was no longer facing me. It was slumped completely to one side of his shoulder. His eyes stared blankly and lifelessly up at the ceiling. The skin on his face had turned a ghastly gray, showing signs of bloating from days ago. Most horrifying of all, the familiar beige hearing aid on his right ear was gone. Where the device used to sit, there was only a streak of dried, blackened blood clinging to his flesh. The terrifying reality exploded in my mind like a bucket of ice water splashed across my face. Mr. Silas had been murdered days ago inside his own home. The killer had stolen the old man's hearing aid to turn it into a short-range tracking device. And that man was standing right behind my office door, listening to my every heartbeat. The wooden office door was violently shoved open from the outside. A gaunt man with a hollow, emaciated face stepped in. On his right ear, he was wearing Mr. Silas's blood-stained beige hearing aid. His eyes were wide and wild, vacant like someone high on drugs or in a state of psychotic frenzy. From the smart speaker sitting on my desk, his low chuckle was still emitting steadily through the short-range frequency. "I found you," he whispered. His mouth didn't even move. The sound transmitted straight from the hearing aid into my smart speaker. He pulled a long dagger from his coat pocket, its rusty steel blade gleaming under the light of my computer monitor. He lunged straight at me with blinding speed. Letting out a manic growl, in that life-or-death moment, my survival instinct flared stronger than ever. I swung the metal baseball bat in my hands, delivering a fatal strike toward him. The blow, backed by every ounce of strength I possessed, struck him right in the side of the head, exactly where the hearing aid was. A dull, hollow crack echoed at the same time as a piercing, deafening shriek blared from the smart speaker system as the audio receiver was crushed. The man staggered, crashing forward into the bookshelf, his agonizing screams muffled. The bloody hearing aid flew onto the floor, shattering into several pieces of plastic debris. Without wasting a single second, I dropped the baseball bat and bolted out the door. I ran down the wooden stairs at a breakneck pace, not daring to look back even once. I ripped open the main lock on the first floor, burst out into the street in the middle of the silent summer night and screamed for help. Neighbors at the end of the street began turning on their lights upon hearing my frantic screams. Just 10 minutes later, 3 Pennsylvania State Police cruisers arrived at the scene, sirens wailing. They quickly cordoned off the narrow walkway between the 2 houses and entered with weapons drawn. A forensics team was also dispatched immediately to handle Mr. Silas's decomposing body in the house opposite. The police found the killer as he was attempting to crawl back under the bed in my bedroom. He was escorted to the patrol car with a bandaged head and his hands locked tightly in handcuffs. A police officer approached, handed me a sip of warm water, and began taking my initial statement. Through their walkie-talkies, I overheard preliminary information about the identity of the captured killer. He was a dangerous schizophrenic who had escaped from a care facility in the neighboring county the previous week. His criminal profile showed a morbid obsession with stalking, occupying living spaces, and monitoring solitary victims through close-range technology. I finalized the sale of that wooden house at a dirt-cheap price within a week of the incident. I accepted a massive financial loss just to leave that suburban neighborhood immediately. Currently, I have moved into a high-rise apartment right in the heart of the city. This place is always flooded with lights and the constant noise of traffic day and night. Surrounding me are hundreds of different households living in the same building. There are no more narrow window gaps less than 2 meters apart like at the old house. I have also changed my entire setup of headphones and audio equipment to traditional wired connections. I accept the hassle of tangled cables in exchange for a sense of absolute safety. My computer storage still holds the recorded file of the static audio from that horrific night. Occasionally, I find myself staring at that file, but I have never had the courage to hit play. The memory of the killer's gaunt face and Mr. Silas's lifeless eyes remains an unyielding haunting. My life has returned to its usual rhythm as a programmer, but the peace in my mind has vanished forever since last summer. Now, whenever I sit working late and accidentally hear a faint static hiss from an electronic device, or when the smart speaker in the living room suddenly emits a prolonged frequency disturbance, my entire body still instantly freezes, and cold sweat breaks out along my spine. I always startle, whipping around to look back into the dark, empty space of the hallway. I wonder if there is another invisible frequency out there, secretly connecting me to another predator. I recently moved to a small town in New England to escape the frantic pace of the big city. The house I rented is an old 2-story wooden home that sits rather isolated from the surroundings. It has a home office on the 2nd floor with a large window looking directly into the side of my next-door neighbor's house. This area is very quiet. During the day you can only hear the wind howling through the old growth trees, and the neighbors around here live like ghosts. No one ever bothers to socialize with anyone else. The owner of the 3-story historic house next door is a middle-aged man. He is skinny, always wearing sharp suits as if he is about to attend a grand event, but his eyes are unnervingly expressionless. The first day I went over to knock on his door to say hello. He only cracked it open just enough to reveal half of his face. He introduced himself as Julian and told me flat out that he requires absolute privacy. I hope we can maintain a respectful distance from each other. I don't like noise. His voice was dead cold, completely flat and devoid of any emotion, and then he slammed the door shut before I could even utter a polite word. But what bothered me the most was that, even though he lives all alone, every now and then at night, the lights in his attic room would be bright red. From my window, I could clearly see the shadows of multiple people cast heavily against the curtains over there. It was late on a Friday night, and I was sitting at my computer finishing up some work when a sudden sound caught my attention. It was the faint, scratchy melody of classical music drifting through the open window of my home office. I paused my typing and listened closely, realizing the sound was coming directly from Julian's attic window. Looking across the narrow gap between our houses, I could see that the lights inside his attic were burning bright. The heavy curtains were partially drawn back, revealing Julian hosting what appeared to be a formal dinner party. There were about 5 or 6 guests gathered around a long table, all dressed in high-end, fashionable attire. The strange thing was that despite the crowd and the music playing, the entire gathering was happening in complete silence. There was absolutely no chatter, no clinking of glasses, and no sound of cutlery touching plates. It was just that old vinyl record playing a repetitive tune that sent an uneasy chill down my spine. Curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed my camera and attached the long zoom lens to get a clearer view. I adjusted the focus on the lens, peered through the viewfinder, and immediately froze in absolute horror. None of the guests around that table were moving a single muscle. They were not real people at all, but highly detailed, life-sized fashion mannequins. Their plastic faces were heavily made up with cosmetics, and they sat perfectly upright, staring down at empty dinner plates. The tension in my chest tightened even more as I watched Julian walk into the frame holding a glass of red wine. He had a warm, genuine smile on his face as he mingled among the lifeless figures. Then he leaned down and whispered something directly into the ear of a female mannequin, as if she were a real person. "You look absolutely stunning tonight. Everyone is so glad you could make it." His soft whisper drifted across the dark space between our houses and reached my ears clearly through the night air. The sheer madness of that scene made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Part 3. Every single night for the following week, Julian's disturbing mannequin parties continued with terrifying regularity. The classical music would start drifting through the air at exactly midnight, and the figures would be wearing entirely different high-end outfits each time. But as I spent hours watching through my camera lens, I began to notice details that completely froze my blood. The physical positions of the mannequins were changing in very subtle ways throughout the night. A hand would be resting on a different part of the table, or a torso would be angled slightly differently than before. This would happen even when Julian had his back turned to them, or when he stepped out of the room to change the vinyl record. The breaking point of my sanity came on a rainy Thursday night. I was peering through my viewfinder when one of the female mannequins slowly turned its head. Its blank, painted face stared directly across the gap, locking its lifeless plastic eyes right onto my office window. It was as if that silent thing knew exactly that I had been watching them this entire time. The sheer terror of that moment made me drop my camera onto the desk, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. By the next evening, the overwhelming, morbid curiosity had completely consumed my mind. Around 9 p.m., I saw Julian carry a heavy leather suitcase out to his sedan, throw it into the trunk, and drive away into the dark. He left his entire house completely pitch black, but through my lens, I could see that the attic door was left slightly unlatched. I knew this was my only chance to find out what kind of sick game my neighbor was playing. I grabbed a heavy flashlight, slipped into a dark hoodie, and quietly walked across the wet grass separating our properties. I made my way around to the blind side of his house and found a small, low-set basement window. Using a pocket knife, I popped the old latch open and carefully slid backward down into the darkness of his basement. The instant my feet touched the concrete floor, a powerful chemical stench hit the back of my throat. It was a suffocating mix of industrial-grade bleach, formalin, and the damp, heavy smell of rot. I kept my flashlight low, scanning the basement walls, which were lined with metal shelves holding jugs of unmarked liquids. I found the wooden staircase leading upward and began to climb the steps as slowly as humanly possible. Every single wooden plank beneath my sneakers let out a sharp, agonizing creak that echoed loudly through the empty house. I stood frozen right in the middle of the dark attic room. Before my eyes were 6 mannequins sitting perfectly upright on wooden chairs, arranged in a neat circle, under the faint beam of my flashlight. Their features looked even more terrifying than they did through the camera lens. A morbid curiosity urged me to take a step closer toward the female mannequin, dressed in the blue evening gown. I hesitated for a brief second before reaching out my hand, gently touching the skin on her neck. An icy chill shot straight down my spine, making me almost scream out loud. This surface was absolutely not synthetic plastic or flexible composite material. It had a primitive, coarse elasticity that felt exactly like real human skin. I shone the flashlight closer and discovered tiny, meticulous stitches running along the back of her neck, hidden just beneath the hairline. Julian was not some eccentric man who just liked collecting dolls or had a weird hobby with plastic figures. He was a twisted serial killer. He had perfectly skinned his victims and then stretched their hides over plastic skeletons to keep them with him forever. "What the hell are you doing in here?" A deep, bone-chilling voice echoed from the wooden staircase below, shattering the silence. The sound of the car engine out front had been completely masked by the howling wind and my own panic. Julian had returned to the house much earlier than expected. I heard his heavy, rapid footsteps rushing up the steps, heading straight for the attic. Pure terror paralyzed my nerves, leaving me rooted to the spot for a few critical seconds. Just as Julian's shadow lengthened across the attic doorway, my survival instinct finally kicked in. I had no way out through the main staircase anymore. I immediately turned around and lunged toward the side door that led to the small balcony at the back of the house. I used all my strength to shove the rotting wooden door open and burst out into the freezing night air. Julian's furious roar erupted right behind me as he realized someone had broken in. I grabbed onto the metal drain pipe running down the side of the house, ignoring the sharp edges cutting painfully into my palms. I slid down frantically, completely letting go of my flashlight as it hit the grass below with a dull thud. The moment my feet touched the ground, I bolted blindly across the pitch-black yard and jumped over the fence separating our properties. I burst into my own house through the side door, threw both deadbolts into place, and collapsed onto the living room floor. My chest was heaving violently, and my heart was pounding so fast and hard that I thought it would burst right open. I woke up when the late morning sunlight shone directly onto my face through the living room window. My entire body was aching and sore after a long night of lying curled up on the cold floor. My mind was spinning with the horrific images from the night before. My palms still carried deep, dried, bloody scratches from gripping the drain pipe when I slid down. I sat up quickly, grabbed my phone from the table, and immediately dialed the town police. "I want to report a murder. My neighbor is a killer." My voice was shaking and broken as I tried to explain the situation to the officer on duty. About 20 minutes later, 2 police cruisers with sirens wailing rushed into the cul-de-sac. I ran out to meet them, standing by my porch and pointing straight at Julian's 3-story historic house. But the first thing that caught my eye at that moment was that his front yard was completely empty. Julian's familiar black sedan had disappeared without leaving a single trace. The main door of the house was tightly shut, and all the windows were covered with dark curtains. The police proceeded to pry the door open and stormed inside to check based on what I had described. They allowed me to stand in the yard, separating our houses to watch the search process. After nearly 2 hours of searching, a detective walked out with a very tense look on his face. He approached me, jotted down a few lines in his notebook, and began to ask probing questions. They found a lot of chemical preservation drums and specialized medical tools in the basement. We confirmed signs of high-dose organic matter processing in the basement, but there were no bodies. All 6 mannequins in the attic had completely vanished, along with Julian, before the police arrived. He had quickly moved his entire collection in the middle of the night, right after I escaped. That afternoon, I saw a few police officers knocking on the doors of the surrounding neighbors to gather information. I stood nearby and heard the responses from my longtime neighbors. They all shook their minds, appearing completely indifferent and surprised by the presence of the authorities. Julian has lived here for 10 years. He was always a quiet neighbor. There was no reason to suspect him at all. An old lady living at the end of the street said casually, as if I were a paranoid person exaggerating the story. The contradiction between what I witnessed with my own eyes and the perception of the community suffocated me. The case quickly reached a dead end because the police did not have enough forensic evidence to identify any victims. With no corpses and no missing persons' identities linked to the scene, the investigation file was just classified as suspicious. 2 weeks after that incident, I immediately packed my things, terminated my lease, and left that New England town forever. I moved to a crowded apartment in the city center, where it was always filled with lights and noise. But the obsession with Julian's plastic faces wearing human skin still haunted me in every late sleep. I never dared to leave my office window open at night anymore. The worst nightmare always repeated every night, when I dreamed of a plastic mannequin standing and watching me. Now, whenever I have to walk past the large fashion stores in the shopping mall, I avoid looking at the display mannequins. My heart stops every time I look into their lifeless glass eyes under the bright neon lights. I break down when I realize I am asking myself a crazy question in my head. Is there a real human being made of flesh and bone looking at me from inside that shiny plastic shell?